So just want to introduce our speaker this evening. Many of you probably know Dr. Ryan Danker. He is Assistant Professor of Church History at Wesley Seminary, not too far from here. He's written a book on Wesley and his evangelical background. I have it at home, but it will have to wait until after comps. Everything is waiting until after comps for me at this point. So he brings a great deal of knowledge about church history with him to speak to us today about Ignatius. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so how many of you have read the Divinity Code or seen the movie? Okay, you could put your hands down. Don't admit that in public again. I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes trying to help cure you of all your reading. I have to admit, I read the book. I enjoyed it. It's a fascinating tale. Of course, now it's, 15 years old. Amazing, isn't it? But I was in Divinity school when it came out, so I had to read it because people were asking me questions about it. And in fact, I went to Divinity school at Duke, and those of you who've been there, the Divinity school is right next to the chapel in that Gothic wonderland, as they call it. And at that point, cell phones weren't powerful enough to get through the thick walls. But I got a phone call from my mother, and I saw that it was ringing, but I knew I wouldn't have reception. And she knew I was in class, and so I thought, my goodness, it's an emergency. So I ran out into the quad in front of the chapel, and I said, Mom, what's going on? And she said, is heaven real? And I said, what? She said, I've been reading the Divinity Code. And I said, well, quit reading those kind of things. And quickly was able to remind her she got the book out of the fiction section. But what's amazing about that book is, number one, so many of us have read it or seen the movie and we still remember it. It took a wonderfully straight historical line that's been verified over and over and over again for centuries, and Brown was able to tweak this story just at the right places, just enough to make a straight line go in an entirely different direction. One of the things he said was that the Council of Nicaea, they voted to make Jesus divine. So, and I thought, well, that's clever. That's very clever. But there was a lot that led up to the council. There was a lot after the council, and so that's really my focus tonight is looking at St. Athanasius. And I've come to realize that people don't like long quotations being read to them. So I've given you the longer quotations from my presentation for you to look at when we get to them. And actually I'm going to start with the quote number one. Actually, just before I get there, there's lots of names involved with this, and so I put the major players' names there so that it's easier to keep track of where I'm going, because we're going to essentially take a romp through church history at a rather brisk pace. I don't want anyone getting left behind, which is another book you shouldn't read. All right. But the first quote from C.S. Lewis, he once remarked about Athanasius, he said this, that Athanasius stood for the Trinitarian doctrine, whole and undefiled, when it looked as if all the civilized world was slipping back from Christianity to the religion of Arius, into one of those sensible synthetic religions, which is so strongly recommended today and which then is now included among their devotees many highly cultivated clergymen. No offense to the two in the room. It is his glory, it's Athanasius' glory, that he did not move with the times. It is his reward that he now remains when those times, as all times do, have moved away. C.S. Lewis wrote that in his wonderful introduction to Athanasius' principal work, which is called On the Incarnation of the Word. And, excuse me, the allergies of being in Washington are back with me. I recommend not only Lewis's introduction, but I recommend Athanasius' work on the Incarnation. It's very accessible, and in fact, it's not that long. But it was Athanasius who, in the 4th century, was at the center of the great debate, or the center of a great debate, that ultimately led the church to finalize, to really concretely declare its vision of who Jesus Christ really was. It took them quite a while to, in fact, put their foot down and say very definitive things about Jesus. At the heart of the debate, and this is key to remember, is this question: who is Jesus? That's at the heart of the entire debate. And of course, we have St. Peter's response. You find many people who say what they think about Jesus in the Bible itself. We have St. Peter, who Jesus asked him, "Who do you say that I am?" Right? To which Peter responded, in the King James, of course, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." All right, but what does that mean? What does that mean? Kevin Van Hooser is a contemporary theologian, and he argues that the role of theology is to rightly name God. I think it's a good way of describing theology, to rightly name God. And that's not an original thought from Van Hooser, but the question, who is Jesus, or how do you rightly name God, I think are in fact the same question. And it's at the heart of the debates that were taking place in the 4th century. So the earliest church, and I think back to we call it the Jesus movement, right after the resurrection. That earliest period, their question wasn't necessarily who was Jesus. Their question was, now what? Right? You can imagine the apostles looking up to heaven, having seen the ascended Christ go up and disappear in front of them. And the angel had to go and move them aside and say, "Go do something productive." They struggled for the longest time with now what? The explosion of the resurrection had taken place, now what? But by the 4th century, the question had kind of morphed, it had changed. And the question is, who is Jesus anyway? Now, there's a great amount of material that takes place between the resurrection of Jesus in 33 AD and what is known as the Christological controversies. Christological, having to do with Christ. I tell my students that's a great cocktail word. It's the kind of word you drop at cocktail parties and people will walk away from you. But the Christological controversies of the 4th century. But suffice it to say that the church obviously believed in a number of fundamentals by this point. It's not as though they don't believe in anything until the 4th century. The church throughout the world believed in one God. The church believed that Jesus was the Son of God, was divine, that he had overcome sin and death through his cross and resurrection. It believed in the Spirit. It believed that Jesus was present in the sacraments. We find all of this in the earliest church. The church even had words such as Trinity, had words such as persons of the Trinity. They used terms like Old Testament and New Testament, bishop and deacon and presbyter, etc., etc. So I don't want you to think that they didn't have all that. But at the root of the question in the 4th century was something a bit deeper than that. And the question then was, what is the nature of God? And of course, that's going a bit deeper than simply saying, all right, God is three but one, which Tertullian said well before the Council of Nicaea. When you do that, though, you bring up the question of what are the sources of revelation? How do you know who God is? And then pertinent question for this period is how much of a role will philosophy play in the answer to the question, who is God, who is Jesus, things like that. So that question, philosophy or Greek thought, if you really want to get down to it, was at the root of Arius' argument. Arius will be declared the arch heretic, the heretic of all heretics. A friend of mine in grad school actually gave me a heresy stamp. I use it if students quote or footnote Wikipedia. But according to Greek thought, this was at the root of Arius' heresy, was the idea that God is immutable. God is immutable, unchanging, untouchable, ultimately unknowable. This was the dominant view of the Greeks when they thought of the ultimate creator God, entirely detached. How could God become one of us if God was immutable? All right, so going right for the doctrine of the incarnation. Isn't it absurd to think that God would put on flesh, tangible flesh, the kind of stuff that dies? Isn't that an absurd thought? And to think that God died on a cross, how crazy is that? I mean, Jesus may have been divine, but obviously, according to Arius, not as divine as the Father. Aha, now you see the heresy. Of course, at this point, I'm hoping the Nicene Creed is running through your head. Even if you have to sing it and hum along with it to get through it. I've been around Anglo-Catholics long enough. So, the question of the Christological debate was one that included the nature of the incarnation. Did God in his fullness come in the person of Jesus? The crucifixion. Did Christ die for the sins of the world, and was he capable of doing such a thing? It brought into question the resurrection. Was he the firstborn of the new creation? Was he really capable of being the firstborn of the new creation? It was on the basis of incarnation and salvation, then, that Athanasius launched his arguments, and really arguing for the full divinity of Christ and the full humanity of Christ. So I'm hoping the creed's going through your head again. But who was this man? Athanasius was a bishop, a very abused bishop. He wasn't the first, nor will he be the last abused bishop. The context of what is sometimes called the Arian debate was the city of Alexandria in Egypt, not Virginia. Most of the major players in the Arian controversy were there. It took place in that location. The debate, however, spread from Alexandria and went throughout the empire. And in fact, we have accounts of people arguing about this in the streets, at the coffee shop. They didn't have coffee shops, but places where people would gather. This is not an academic exercise. This is something that people are debating on the bus. Which is, I think, strange to us anymore, because how often do we all get involved and entangled with theological debates in public? We get involved with other debates, which we will not cover because there's a camera on me right now. Both Athanasius and Arius were clergy within the Alexandrian church, one of the ancient centers of Christian thought. When the controversy broke out, in fact, Athanasius was not bishop. This can be confusing, but Alexander was the bishop of Alexandria. Yeah? And it was actually Alexander who stood up first against Arius, and it was Alexander who in fact spoke at the Council of Nicaea. Because at that point, Athanasius was not a bishop, therefore he could not speak in the council, and Arius was not a bishop, nor could he speak at the council. So they actually had people who represented their interests in the council itself. But what is Arianism? I mean, you've already picked up on some of the heresy, but what is it? In short, it's this. It was the belief that Jesus was not equal to the Father. That's Arianism in a nutshell. Jesus is not equal to the Father. And in fact, Jesus is not only lower than the Father in status, but he's lower in nature. Why? Because he was created. This is Arius' thought. Jesus was a created being. In fact, the first created being, but still a created being. And so for Arius, there was this idea that Jesus kind of, it's interesting, you've got the Father, and you have humanity, and you have the angels, and then you have Jesus kind of floating between the two in this unique situation, this unique place. In fact, the term is, Jesus says, demigod or demiurge. There's a fun word to say. Arius is famous for his statement about Jesus that is this: there was a time when he was not. So there was a time when he was not. And according to Arius' theology, there will be a time when he is not. Right? So, and it's interesting too, Arius was really good at putting his theology to music. And so even in the English translation, it kind of has a certain, there was a time when he was not, you know. And so, you know, perhaps the moral is to watch out for musicians, I don't know. But for Arius, the priest in Alexandria, he taught up this demoted Jesus, as I describe him. And although he was very popular, he was in fact censored by Alexander, the bishop. Bishop publicly challenged him and called his teaching heretical, which is that great term created by St. Irenaeus that essentially describes, the best way I've come to understand heresy is a cancer within the body of Christ. And it's the best way to understand it. It's something within. It's not something without. It's something that takes place within. It was this challenge then, the challenge of Alexander to Arius, that was the focus of the debate at Nicaea, the great council that gave us most of what we call the Nicene Creed, and that was in the year 325. Now, I've heard people describe, the great debate as happening between Arius and Athanasius at the council. That's a common misperception. I think I've already said a little bit about it, but it's interesting. The primary players at the council were Alexander and a man named Eusebius of Nicomedia. And some of the reports are fascinating. Eusebius gets up to present the Arian concept, and he barely gets into it before the bishops storm the floor and take away his notes and stomp them to the ground. There was an immediate reaction. There was not this, this wasn't a deliberate kind of nice committee meeting where we'll consider any proposal. They gutturally reacted to this. Why? Because the church had always taught that Jesus was in fact fully God and fully man. The fact that it hadn't put its foot down was because it hadn't had to. That's the loophole that Dan Brown used. And it's something I really enjoy teaching early church history to my students, because I'm able to lead them through the various stages of the church's development. And by the time we get to Nicaea, everyone's like, well, of course. And really, that is the way it unfolded. It's a wonderful thing about church history. The great tradition of the church existed from the beginning in the way the church worshipped, in its documents, in the scriptures, in other ways. But what happened is that as the church grew, and especially as it became the favored religion of Constantine, then you had to put down, kind of legalese type statements about what the church had taught from the beginning. But it's one thing for a council to declare a doctrine, it's another thing entirely for the rank and file to embrace it. You can make a pronouncement on high all you want, but if the people don't embrace it, good luck. And so we can't underestimate the power of Arianism, because in fact it did not die on the floor of the Council of Nicaea. And for a time, Arianism in fact thrived. It thrived among the powerful, it thrived among the elite, among the well-educated, within the empire, and then, interestingly enough, with the barbarians to the north of the empire. So that's a fascinating coalition of the elite and educated with the barbarians. And because of this, because there was this great groundswell of Arian thought and embracing of Arianism, there's a phrase that comes out of this, and it's called Athanasius contra mundum. Athanasius against the world. And it's you'll talk about that when we get to the discussion groups. But it's Athanasius who was the one who would define the Orthodox position after the council. It's really his work, and I think this is key, after the council and then after the death of Alexander, which was 3 years after the council. Now, I already told you Athanasius was made the bishop of Alexandria. He tried to get away from that. In fact, he tried to run off and hide in the desert when they first proposed to make him a bishop. And there was opposition to him becoming a bishop because he was young. But because he was young, he actually served, once he was elected, for 47 years as the bishop or patriarch of Alexandria. Now, 17 of those years, though, he was in exile. So the idea of Athanasius contra mundum continues despite his being elected to the episcopacy. Another thing to remember, the councils can determine things, and we can look back and we can see the 7 councils of the church, and we can chart it out, etc., etc. But on the ground, the church doesn't really ever turn on a dime, right? There were the celebrations, the 50-year celebrations of Vatican II, and they're talking about how it's still unfolding and all these other things. Well, the church even today with our great communications doesn't turn on a dime. And so it would take most of the 4th century, in fact, for Arianism to be stamped out. Finally, the Council of Constantinople in 381, the Nicene statement is reaffirmed strongly, and in fact they expand it. This expanded version is what we say on Sunday mornings, by the way. But we don't have the entire story for the creed tonight. Athanasius has a nickname, and I really like the nickname. He was called the Black Dwarf. He was called the Black Dwarf. And the reason why is because he was dark-skinned and very short. I love the idea of this little black man standing up against all the elites and the powerful and the educated and saying no. It's wonderful. The time and place of his birth is not known. It's likely he was born in an obscure village somewhere along the Nile. And we have rough dates, 296 to 298. So we don't even know the exact year of his birth. He spoke Coptic. So in other words, he was native Egyptian. This is the Copts, even at this point in time, were not in charge of Egypt, as Egypt obviously has been overtaken by various powerful forces for quite a while. But he was a member of the lower classes. Now, we also know he had connections, very close connections, with the desert monks. And they're an interesting group. I recommend reading the sayings of the Desert Fathers. They're absolutely fascinating, especially when they get into fights with demons. I was telling my students about St. Anthony getting into fights with demons and stuff, and the look on their face was just, they couldn't believe I was saying this with a straight face. But he, in fact, was known for his fighting with demons. They were also known for being holy, hermits, people of wisdom, other things. It's fun to talk about their brawls with the demons, but anyway, that's not the point. Athanasius came under the monks' influence, and because of this, he lived a very disciplined life, a very rigid life. And it gained him respect, in fact, with both his friends and his enemies. It's kind of hard to take shots at somebody who's obviously holy. Justo Gonzalez, who's a contemporary theologian, a church historian, has written that of all the opponents of Arianism, Athanasius was the one to be feared most. His strongest attributes, however, was this. It was his connection to everyday people. It's probably his strongest attribute. Even with the clarity of his writing, I think his strongest attribute was his ability to connect with everyday people. We're not talking about an academic theologian in an ivory tower. He lived out his faith in the midst of everyday people, without pomp and without the increasingly complex ideology of the Arians. He was an author. Even before the controversies, he had written 2 books, both of which lay heavy emphasis on the doctrine of the Incarnation, the doctrine that declares that God became human in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. For Athanasius, in fact, everything hinged on the doctrine of the Incarnation. And it's by means of the Incarnation for Athanasius that salvation enters the world. This comes to our quote number 2, I believe. Yes, quote number 2. It's a bit long, so I want to go through it. This is from On the Incarnation. Although being himself, and he's speaking of the Word, although being himself powerful and the creator of the universe, he prepared for himself in the Virgin the body as a temple, and made it his own as an instrument, making himself known and dwelling in it, and thus taking from ours that which is like, since all were liable to the corruption of death, delivering it over to death on behalf of all. So he became, right, humanity is subject to death because of the fall. And so he took on humanity, that he might present humanity to God. Okay, that's really what he's saying. He offered it to the Father, doing this in his love for human beings, so that on the one hand, with all dying in him, right, all dying in Christ, the law concerning corruption in human beings might be undone, its power being fully expended in the lordly body, right, in Christ's body, and no longer having any ground against similar human beings. And on the other hand, that as human beings had turned towards corruption, he might turn them again to incorruptibility and give them life from death by making the body his own, and by the grace of the resurrection, banishing death from them as straw from the fire. So God himself, we can simplify this a little bit, God himself in the person of Jesus, being one of us, brought salvation to us. And only as one of us could this salvation have been brought. All right? He was known to say God became human so that humans could become God. Now, you probably should put a like in there to get the full meaning. So God became human so that humans could become like God. But let me simplify his theology even further. The idea is that humanity is condemned to death because of sin. But only God has the power to save them. But in fact, it's to God that humanity owes almost like a debt because they're the ones who fell into sin, right? So it has to be a human who then offers themselves to God as sacrifice. But no human's good enough to do that. See the problem? So, in a very simplifying him very quickly, you could say that God had to come in human flesh and die on our behalf, because only God could do that, but only as man could he in fact represent us to the Father. Does that make sense? Got some head is nodding. Only as man could in fact God die, and in fact lead humanity through death, right? It's the I'm leaving my notes, which is always dangerous, and my students know this. They love it when I do that. But what I want you to get the gist of his argument very quickly. God became human so that humans could in fact be presented to God as a holy and living sacrifice. And in fact, then, using the words of the prayer book, right, we, in union with that sacrifice, receive redemption, because the God-man, in fact, did it for us. Okay. Watch the video if you don't get it. But it's interesting. He goes even deeper than that. It's not just that God had to become man in order that man might be saved. It's the idea that humanity is in fact sanctified, made holy, because God becomes one of us. So the very idea of being human is in fact redeemed because God became one of us. And this is why I think we see in Athanasius, as with Bishop Alexander and the desert monks and all the rest of them, this is why they challenged Arianism. Because what was at stake was salvation. The idea then isn't, getting into some philosophical debate. The idea is to look at Arius and say, I'm sorry, your Jesus simply isn't good enough. He in fact could not accomplish the work of salvation. He was not made man. He did not, in fact, have the power to do what was necessary to bring salvation. Now, the stories about Athanasius and what he endured for the sake of orthodoxy, I think, are fascinating. I'm glad I didn't have to live through them myself. I already told you he tried to hide before being made a bishop. That was in 328. Shortly thereafter, in fact, the Arians, they're not going to give up. They attack him, and they, not physically, but they accuse him of murdering another bishop. So Arius was said to have murdered a bishop named Arsenus, and he was said to have dabbled in magic, and that he was a tyrant over the Christians in Egypt. Of course, the emperor is told about this through a subordinate, and he summons Athanasius to Tyre to answer for these charges. All right, so having heard the charges, what does Athanasius do? I think this is great. He was good at theatrics. He brings a man with him covered in a cloak. And after making sure that a number of people in the room actually knew the bishop he supposedly murdered, he then unveils the bishop in front of them. to show that obviously he didn't kill him. But the Arians wouldn't stop and said that he had obviously cut off that bishop's hand and used it for magic. So what obviously brings the bishop back in to show them his hands, and only after that do the rumors die down that Athanasius was a murderer who dabbled in magic. It's interesting. Wanting to clear his name with the emperor, Athanasius went to Constantinople to see him. A local bishop, Eusebius of Nicomedia, whose name you should recognize, right? The same Arian bishop who received a not so warm welcome at Nicaea, in fact kept him from the emperor. Finally, Athanasius caught hold of the rein of the emperor's horse to get his attention. And the trick worked. He got his meeting with the emperor, but then the emperor thought he was dangerous and impulsive, which he might have been. Based on rumors that Athanasius would in fact stop the flow of wheat from Egypt to Rome, which is the same issue if you're familiar with Roman history. That's what Mark Antony tried to do, right? He was then banished from Alexandria and he was sent to Trier in the west. Shortly thereafter, in fact, Constantine I died, so 337. And Constantine's 3 sons succeeded him, going back to ancient history class in undergrad, right? All the exiled bishops, and there were quite a number of them, interestingly enough, were allowed to return to their episcopal sees at this point. Yet this was not the end of Athanasius' struggles. He was exiled, by the way, 5 times from his diocese. It was the beginning of a long string of struggles that he went through. All right, so when he got back from his first exile, for instance, there was a rival bishop of the Arian variety who had been put in his place. His name was Gregory, and he had the backing of the local government. And when Athanasius arrived, what happened? Violence breaks out. They fought over church buildings. Athanasius, in fact, thought it was best if he leaves so that the violence would end. He was smuggled to Rome. The governor had said he was not allowed to travel, where what happens essentially is Athanasius gains the backing of the Bishop of Rome and also the emperor. And it's by the Roman Church then that Athanasius is declared to be the true and legitimate Bishop of Alexandria. But he was not allowed to return to Egypt immediately. That would take time. And by the time he gets back, Gregory had so mismanaged the church that he was in fact greeted as though he was a hero. So it's an interesting story of this back and forth, exile, hero, stop the violence, fight the Arians. It's the idea of Athanasius Contra Mundum is really in fact very true. But it doesn't even stop in terms of his own diocese. Constantius, who was emperor, a decidedly pro-Arian emperor, in fact tried to make life even worse for Athanasius, and any bishop who was not willing to distance themselves from Athanasius fell out of the emperor's favor. He dies, though, and Julian, his cousin, was made emperor of both the East and the West. And all of a sudden we have bishops going back to where they'd been before they were exiled again. And he took no sides in the debate. Why? Because he was going to reinstitute paganism. And so you have the old religion of Rome coming back. And this is why Julian is called the apostate. It's interesting, for those of you who know English church history, it's almost similar to the back and forth after Henry VIII between Catholics and Protestants for almost 200 years. It's this back and forth and back and forth. And you just have to learn how to ride the waves of political context. But what was Athanasius' ultimate contribution to the church? And I say it's this: he helped to solidify the belief about Jesus that had been from the beginning. A few years after his death in 373, Gregory of Nazianzus, who was one of the great church fathers, said that he was, quote, a pillar of the church. For Athanasius, according to Gonzalez, and this is quote 3, the corruption of humanity as the result of sin was such that a new creation was required, a radical reformation and restoration of what had been destroyed by sin. The work of salvation is no lesser than the work of creation. Therefore, the one responsible for our recreation can be no lesser than the one responsible for our creation. We can put this in Athanasius' own words concerning Jesus, quote number 4. Being the Word of the Father, and above all, he alone, consequently was both able to recreate the universe and was worthy to suffer on behalf of all and to intercede for all before the Father. So you have this back and forth between the full humanity and the full divinity, or the necessity of them both. What I like about Athanasius' writing, and you got a glimpse of it in that longer quote, is it's out of love that the Word became flesh. Out of love. So that as flesh, he might die on behalf of all flesh, but as God, he sanctified our existence and overcame the power of sin and death. Arius' Jesus, as I said, simply wasn't good enough. Only the God-man, fully God, fully man, could accomplish the salvation of the world. So the last quote from Athanasius, for we were the purpose of the Word's embodiment, and for our salvation he so loved human beings as to come to be and appear in a human body. Thank you very much. We could probably do a little bit of Q&A since I went through. I thought, this could have taken 2 hours, but I went through that quick. It's unfortunate tonight. I have to go back to the seminary and teach a class. So Father Sean is going to lead you in the discussion groups. But are there any specific questions about the lecture itself that just are burning in you? Everything was clear as a bell.
What year was that council you were talking about?
Nicaea was 325. And then and it's Nicaea 1. There was a second one. And Constantinople 1 was 381. Yeah.
Arianism alive and well anywhere these days? It's long gone.
I mean, as a pure Arianism is probably gone.
Yeah.
It's the Unitarians that would be the closest to it, or some liberal Protestants went far enough in their theology that they became forms of Arian. Because at the root of liberal Protestantism was the idea that the miraculous simply didn't take place, and so that it's I don't want to say liberal Protestants don't believe in the divinity of Jesus, but there were some within that camp at its heyday who you read their writings and you wonder. Let's put it that way. I think that the most common heresy today is still Gnosticism. Still Gnosticism, the idea that salvation is saving us from the flesh, and that everything to do with God is intangible. And of course, that really undermines the incarnation. It undermines the crucifixion. It undermines the very concept of the sacraments. Why would you take bread and wine? If they're tangible. So I think that's probably the most common. So, yeah.
Who believes that?
Who believes that? In Gnosticism? I don't think there's an organized group called the Gnostics. In fact, in the early church there were Gnosticisms, but it was this denial of the value of the tangible, and I think we see that from time to time. The idea that one dies and their spirit goes to heaven, but there's nothing to do with the body, as though the resurrection of the body will not take place, is a form of Gnostic thought. It's not classic Gnosticism, but there's streams of it. Yeah. In fact, there's no new heresy. They're all just recycled. They just come out in different forms. So once you've got the classics down, you can start identifying them and get a stamp. So, yeah.
I want to thank
Nancy.
you for these wonderful quotes of Athanasius.
Oh, good.
I mean, they're so logical and so clearly stated and built. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, I think one of his gifts is being clear.
Yes.
And in fact, I gave you one of the harder quotations from the book. So he's like I said, he was an everyday person who reached out to everyday people and presented the gospel, and I admire that. Yeah, of course that might just be my Methodism coming out, right? Yeah. So, well, great. Thank you so much.
Okay.